Yo, is that... Yo, there's a spider up there.
Boom.
Hey there, how's it going? Welcome back to the Let's Play world. In the last episode, I finally tackled the Super Smelter. I redesigned it much more faithfully to the original by Ilmango. Please check him out, by the way. He is fantastic and way better at redstone than I will ever be. Then I rebuilt it in the world here, made sure it worked perfectly, and called it a day. And today I'd like to pick up right where I left off and continue working to get this thing fully operational. Now, the first thing I want to figure out is fuel. In the last episode, I was using coal, and while that is a good fuel source, there's a better one. Come on, you know what I'm talking about. It's kelp. We all knew it was kelp. It's super easy to farm and can be turned into a dried kelp block, which does 20 smelts versus the measly 8 that coal can do. So to begin with, I need to figure out two things. Number one, what kind of kelp farm design do I want to make? And number two, how quickly do I want to produce this kelp? I wonder where I'm gonna find a design. Let's see here. Oh, yep, there we go. So the concept for this farm is pretty simple. You have a tank filled with kelp, and you harvest it using flying machines every 20 minutes as dictated by a daylight sensor. Then the drops are pushed up to the top where they get pushed over to a water stream, and you can take them wherever you'd like. I'd like to remind everyone that anything I use that's made by somebody else will be linked in the description, so if you're interested in checking this farm out, you know where to find it. So now that we know our kelp farm design, we need to figure out how quickly we want it to produce. One of these 40 wide tanks yields approximately 2,000 kelp per hour, and I want to be able to fully refuel my super smelter in a half hour. Now, thankfully, I don't mean that I want to refill every furnace with a stack of kelp blocks. That would be insane. What I do mean by a full load is the maximum amount that I think I'm going to be able to put into this system. Because shulker boxes are in a somewhat short supply for me, I'm thinking that 10 shulker boxes is my limit for right now. I like this idea because I don't see myself collecting more than that much sand at a time. 10 is also a really good number because putting that exact amount into the system fully utilizes the 20 smelting uses that a dried kelp block has. So quick maths, 10 shulker boxes of items divided amongst 144 furnaces equals 120 items per furnace. That comes out to 6 dried kelp blocks per furnace, or 13.5 stacks total. Get used to the math, we're only halfway through. So we have to figure out how many of these we need to make 13.5 stacks every half hour. 9 kelp makes a block, and that comes out to approximately 8,000 kelp. But the kelp needs to be smelted first, and I'd like to use some of the blocks that I produce to do so, which means I need an additional 6 stacks for a total of 18.5, which comes out to almost 11,000 items. This module here does 1,000 every half hour, which means I'm gonna have to build it 11 times. Oh boy. Now, because this thing is going to be an extension of my forge and hence part of the whole Dwarven theme, I want to build with that in mind. My first ideas going into this are I want to have big Dwarven columns going up into archways and have the glass be a viewing port in between the columns. And for the layout, I think I'm going to have it be a large hallway just because that sort of suits the Dwarven theme and it'll make it easier to repeat the design. I even think it might be fun to play around with lighting a little bit, like putting redstone lamps everywhere and having a pressure plate that will activate everything in chunks going down the hallway. But I won't really know if any of these ideas stick until I actually start messing around with it. So I'm gonna go ahead and get building here, and I'm done. So I spent almost a week designing this thing, and I could honestly spend an entire video just talking about it, but instead I'll try and just give you guys the TLDR. I changed the layout from a straight hallway into a T intersection because I wanted my tunnels to feel more immersive and interesting. Plus, it's also a great opportunity to expand in the future or connect up with other underground tunnels. Besides that, a lot of my original ideas stayed true to the final product. I've got tall Dwarven columns going into angled archways spaced in between vaulted granite ceilings. And in between the columns, you have the glass kelp tanks that you can view while it's running. The elevated platform was an afterthought because I wanted to keep the spacious feel of the room while also having a higher vantage point to view the tanks. And if you look behind the tanks, you'll see I made a gradient of sandstone going down to granite, which is a similar concept to what I did in the previous episode for the super smelter. The consideration is that this whole Dwarven area is located underneath my soon-to-be custom desert biome, and thus as you get closer to the surface, you will encounter more sandstone than rock. At the bottom, carved into the granite, is a water stream that transports the collected kelp to the end of the tunnel, where it will await its next step that we'll talk about later. I also did mess around with my idea for lighting, and while I will say that it took a lot more time than I was expecting, it was ultimately worth it because it's extremely cool. When it's turned on, it goes down the hallway evenly, cuts through the T intersection over here, and then ends at the same time on the other end. I have redstone lamps located at the top and bottom of each tank and hidden behind the slabs for the water stream. And making sure that these lamps turned on evenly was an important detail that I made sure to get right because the effect is pretty cool. I was also going to include the pathway lamps for this system, but I decided against it because I'd have no way to prevent mob spawning, which reminds me that every other surface is covered in slabs and or stairs so that when the lights are turned off, there's no risk of mob spawns. So let's talk about the actual farm now. I stacked the tanks too high for every section so that we're producing double what we would have normally. The left side is pretty straightforward. It's essentially identical to the original that I showed you, but it's been extended to be much longer. The right side, however, is a bit trickier because of the T-intersection. Luckily, the flying machines can easily send out a signal to power another if you attach an observer block to it. This was trivial at the corners because they're practically touching each other, but at the other end, it was a lot more complicated. I needed to be able to send the signals underneath the farm and activate both flying machines at the same time and have it go both ways. I was stuck on this for a while, but my final iteration that we see here takes the signal from only the bottom flying machine and sends it to both on the other side using an instant redstone wire. An instant wire uses this trick with a piston and a torch. Don't ask me how it works, I don't know, it just does. And then the rest of it is just your standard torch tower, but this doesn't work instantly, so I had to delay the bottom flying machine to make sure that both of them activated at the same time. And finally, for the activation, as I said earlier, it uses a daylight sensor. And I'm using this trick with a sandstone wall and an observer to instantly send that signal downwards to, again, get an equally timed activation. So yeah, the kelp farm is all done and ready to be built in the Let's Play world. But we're not quite out of the water yet because, like I mentioned earlier, I'll also need to smelt this kelp and craft it into blocks, which ironically means that I'll need to create another super smelter. And that's exactly what I've been working on. I'm very proud of myself because this is the first redstone project I've done completely on my own without looking anything up. I know it might not seem like much, but little victories, guys. At the top, we have the water stream from the kelp farm, and that flows down into a familiar 8-way item splitter. The issue with this splitter is that it favors sending items a certain way if only a couple flow in at a time. To prevent that issue, I came up with this stopper here to clump all the items together after a harvest. That way, when I'm ready to send them into the system, I can press this button and they'll all go in at once and the splitter will divide the items evenly. Then I'll press this button here to distribute the items into the system. There are 8 furnaces per minecart and 8 minecarts for a total of a 64 furnace array. I had to add a timer to the system so that there would be enough time for the minecarts to pick up at least 16 items and guarantee that each furnace gets filled twice. The timer is an identical rail line with a detector rail at the end which sends the signal to a pulse extender that powers the rails. Originally I had the timer much shorter because hopper minecarts pull items really quickly and it just wasn't necessary. But I realized that I had to make it longer in case a dropper empties out, because then it will refill at normal hopper speed. And that's not fast enough. Now let's talk about fueling this bad boy. I want to always keep the system backlogged with kelp. That way it's ready to go and I don't have to worry about waiting after I do a harvest at the kelp farm. And this makes it kind of interesting because the amount of items I smelt will be dictated by how much fuel I put in. The cool thing about it being a 64 furnace array is that it means for every stack of dried kelp blocks I send in, I get exactly 20 stacks of items smelted, and that makes it easy to do the math. So once I figure out how much I want to smelt, I'll fill this chest minecart with the designated amount of fuel and then send it off to start the smelter. It will cycle back and forth throughout the system, filling the furnaces, and will only return once it's fully emptied. This turned out to be really tricky for me to figure out. It sounds simple, but when it's 2 a.m. and you've been on this project all day, believe me, it was not. The way that I ultimately figured it out was having the minecart stop at a checking station every time it comes to the end of the line. If the station sees that it's empty when it arrives, then it will unlock the rail at the beginning of the track and let it return to be filled again. Otherwise, it will cycle through the system again and again until it empties. The circuit checks for the minecart's presence with a detector rail and checks its contents with a comparator. The rail at the beginning needs to be unpowered to let the minecart out, and that only happens when one of the 2 signals goes off because one of the signals is inverted. My last little elegant touch is the same button that sends off the minecart also pushes down this piston to reset the rail switch. And finally, everything that gets smelted leaves the system via these minecarts down below that transfers them into this water stream here, which finally brings it to storage. You'll recognize at the top another 8-way item splitter, except in this case it's been reduced down to a 6-way splitter that funnels 3 hopper lines into each chest stack. Once a stack is full, as indicated by a redstone lamp, I can come in and break all of the chests, which will drop down the items to my feet, where I will also find a crafting table, and I can now craft the kelp blocks without having to leave my inventory. The one flaw is that some of the items do get stuck on top of the hoppers, but it's a simple enough solution to just pillar up and fetch them. And just like that, this project is done too. Well, mostly done. I still need to design the aesthetics for it, but before I do, I need to return my attention back to the Let's Play world. Finally, this is a Let's Play episode, lest we forget. So let's recap. The kelp farm is fully designed and ready to be built. The kelp smelter is designed, but I don't have the aesthetics figured out yet. And then of course we have the super smelter itself, but you know, that doesn't have an interface. So my next step here is to come up with a design for it, and it's gonna be tricky. I wanna make it big, but I also have to build within certain restraints. To name a few, the surface is very close to the ceiling here, I have a beacon beam very close on the right, and I have a mining staircase close on the left. I also need to figure out how this interface is gonna connect with the other two systems that I'm gonna build, and that brings me back to the kelp smelter. I guess my plan is to just hope that I'll have a good idea for how to design the aesthetics for it while I'm doing all of this. At the moment, I got nothing, honestly. But as I always tend to do, after many hours of design work, I did eventually figure it out. To start, I used World Edit to copy that chunk of my world into my creative one, and that's where I did all of my design work. From there, I got to work designing the layout, and I spent a lot of time just messing around with the height and spacing in order to get the right feel, and also to work around the restraints that I mentioned earlier. I was stuck on this step for a while. Every time I thought I had gotten it just right, I'd discover a new issue that would set me back to square one. Too close to the bedrock project, in the way of another beacon. I can't avoid this staircase. Stupid, stupid, stupid. This project did not play nice, but that did not deter me. I had a massive vision for an over-the-top awesome build, and I was not gonna stop until I made that vision a reality. Eventually, I had finally adjusted everything perfectly, and from there, the design and detail work seemed to just fall into place. After hours and hours of design work, I had finally finished it. Not only did it live up to my expectations, it exceeded them, and it looks glorious. So without further ado, I give you my new Super Smelter Forge. Aw, what's wrong? You can't see it? Oh, well, sucks to be you, I guess. Yeah, you don't get to see that yet. But hey, I will show you how the kelp smelter turned out. When you exit the forge, you're brought into a hallway loosely inspired by this picture of a Dwemer ruin from Skyrim. The other doorways don't lead to anything yet. I'm keeping it open-ended so that I can add stuff later. But if I go off to the left here, I'm brought into this neat little room. There's a water stream in the middle where you'll see the incoming kelp rise up as they make their way to the smelter. Originally, the floor was just made out of sandstone, but it was a little plain, so I decided to add this aquarium floor to make it look a little more interesting. It's got some kelp and fishies in it, and I also put in some sea pickles for lighting. First time I've ever used them before. And as for the interface itself, the right side has the storage columns you saw earlier where you craft the kelp blocks, and on the left is the refueling interface. I've got storage in the middle so I can keep a surplus of fuel ready to go. Then there are the two different minecarts. The one on the right sends the kelp blocks into the kelp smelter here, and the one on the left sends them over to the super smelter. Again, both of these will cycle back and forth until they empty, which is when they'll return to here. I like the way this will work in practice. I'll come over here after I trigger a harvest at the kelp farm, get my 6 stacks of kelp blocks, and send it off to make the 13.5 I'll need for the super smelter. If I have a surplus, then I can just send that over right away. And while I wait, I could go back over to the super smelter and get that started, or just come over here and craft some blocks. It's efficient, it's all close by, and most importantly, it works. I hope. Also, yes, I know I had hopper minecarts at first here. Don't do that. Use the chest ones. Oh, also, please note that I'm using smokers instead of regular furnaces because they're quicker at smelting kelp. And just like that, I have everything designed and figured out. All that's actually left to do is go back into the Let's Play world, gather all the materials, and actually build it. But that will have to wait until part 2. Ah, stupid spider. Get out of my shot, you infernal beast.
Boom.
Hey, how's it going? If you enjoyed the video, then please go ahead and inflate my ego, and be sure to also subscribe so you won't miss out on part 2. I promise it will come out a lot quicker than this one, believe me.